This is Common Ground with me, Sonja Wolf, and with me today is Reece Jones to talk about immigration, racial exclusion, and white supremacy in the United States. Reece Jones is a geographer and professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and he's also the author of White Borders. Hi, Reece. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I wanted to invite you to this podcast to talk about white supremacy, but also the issue of immigration. The United States is widely known as a nation of immigrants, but you point out in your book, White Borders, that this is in fact a myth, that anti-immigrant politics has been the norm, and that immigration laws serve to protect a version of the United States as a white country. So at the beginning, I would like to ask you to talk a little bit about ideas before we turn to white supremacy itself. It seems that there are two visions of the country that is called the United States of America. On the one hand, universalism, on the other hand, white supremacy. What is behind these two ideas?
Yeah, that's a big question and an important one. I think in the documents, the founding documents of the United States, you can see those universalist ideas, right? When they talk about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and equal rights for all people. But those documents are in contrast to the actions of the people who were founding the country, right? Many of the founders of the United States were engaged in slavery. There's the 3/5 compromise in the U.S. Constitution. So there are all kinds of ways that a white supremacist version of the country found its way into those founding documents. And so what I argue in White Borders is that conflict between this idea, on the one hand, that the United States is a settler colony where people are immigrating in and have their origins elsewhere, is one part of that founding notion of the country. But there's the other part of it, that those original founders were predominantly white, right? And many of them were engaged in slavery. And what I argue in the book is that they were open to immigrants coming to the country as long as those immigrants were white. And as soon as non-white immigrant groups started to arrive, that's when all of these new immigration laws were put in place to put limits on that non-white immigration to the country.
How have these two visions manifested over time? Because you just referred to the founders and the founding documents, but throughout the long history of the United States, what are some examples of how universalism, but also white supremacy, have expressed themselves?
Yeah, I think the two have been in conflict with each other, right? You could see that in the Civil War period, for example, right, with the emancipation of slaves, and then the following up of that with amendments to the Constitution that create things like birthright citizenship, that have equal protection under the law for all people. So there are these ideals of equality that are based in those documents and in the vision for the country in the aftermath of the Civil War in the 1860s. But as we see each time in the US that there's some movement towards equal rights or towards rights for Black or minority populations in the country, there seems to be a response to that pulls those back, right? And reasserts the rights of the dominant white population. And in the period after the Civil War, we see that in the Reconstruction period where Jim Crow laws come into effect, which are laws that protect white rights at the expense of all others. We see the emergence of groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which carry out terrorism towards Black and immigrant populations in the country. And we see efforts to restrict the arrivals of other non-white peoples to the United States. It's just after the Civil War that the first immigration laws come into place.
I'd like to turn to the roots of white supremacy now. And there are some, again, ideas, not to call them theories, but again, ideas, some concepts that have been very influential and that we need to touch on in order to understand white supremacy as it manifests at the moment, also in the context of the Trump administration. So could you take us back again a little bit into history and take us through some of the key concepts that the audience will need to understand in the context of white supremacy?
Yeah, maybe before that, I will mention one early document that kind of creates the foundation for that in the United States, which is the first naturalization law in the country, which talked about who could become a citizen of the United States. And it had language that said that citizenship was restricted to free white persons. So from 1790, there was a notion that to be a member of the citizenry in the United States, you needed to be white. What that document doesn't do is define what white is. It's an ambiguous term and a term that didn't have a clear definition. So what I look at in the book, in White Borders, is as the post-Civil War period happens, as this kind of reimposition of white dominance is happening through Jim Crow laws and also through immigration restrictions, there's this need to kind of create some sort of foundation for what white is and why white people are superior. So we see the emergence of the eugenics movement. We also see race science become a key area of research in universities in the United States, in places like MIT and Columbia. A key area of research was coming up with schemes to explain why white people were superior, right? So it's during this period that things like IQ tests are developed, right? Or the SAT test, the Scholastic Aptitude test, is also created during this period as ways to kind of measure these differences between races in an effort to argue that the white race is the superior race, right? And that it's dominant above these other races, almost as a scientific justification for the exclusions happening through these new immigration laws and the violence that's being targeted towards minority Black populations in the US.
So some of the ideas that you explain at length in your book are eugenics that you just mentioned, social Darwinism also. But you emphasize that race really is a term that is socially constructed. You mentioned earlier that it's in fact, or it has proven quite complicated actually over the years in the United States to define who counts as a white person. So taking us a little bit more into current times and thinking a little bit already of the Trump administration, where these ideas are also influential. These early ideas or the roots of white supremacy, how have they shaped how the country has responded to immigration?
Yeah, so immigration has been seen through this lens of white supremacy from its earliest days. The first immigration laws in the United States were Chinese exclusion laws. The U.S. didn't have any restrictions at the federal level about who could enter the country until the 1870s. There had been some state efforts to do that, but the Supreme Court had ruled twice that this was the domain of the federal government. So it wasn't until a large number of immigrants from China started to arrive after the gold rush to the west coast of the United States that there was suddenly this need to put in place these restrictions on who could enter the country. In the book, I look at the debates around the Chinese Exclusion Acts and the language that they're using in the Senate to argue for these laws is striking in the ways that it mirrors the way that people talk about immigration today, right? The same arguments, the same fear mongering about the other, about the threat that the immigrant poses, were present from the start in these debates. The Chinese are described as bringing diseases to the country, as bringing crime, as bringing drugs. Of course, at that time, it was opium that the Chinese were bringing to the U.S. The Chinese were described as being lazy, right? As just coming here to take advantage of living in the United States, but also somehow simultaneously outworking white Americans, right? And working harder than those Americans to take the jobs of white Americans, right? So kind of this ability to be all of these different things at the same time. And also both described as unassimilable, right? Not able to become American in the same way that migrants from Europe could do that, but also somehow transforming America into a different place based on Chinese cultural practices. So it's all of the same sort of rhetoric that we see today about an invasion, about diseases, about crime, as a way to kind of fearmonger about the other, which also does the work of kind of creating the identity of the in-group, the self of that nation.
You mentioned that there have been immigration periods related to certain nationalities. For a time, there was European immigration. You mentioned Chinese immigrants, and nowadays, particularly with the Trump administration, there appears to be an emphasis on Latino immigrants, often Mexican immigrants. Could you refer perhaps a little bit to Latino immigration and how, at least from the white supremacist perspective, this idea or the fear of a great replacement is relevant?
Yeah, so in White Borders, I argue that the idea of great replacement, which is the notion that an immigrant group is going to come into the United States or Western European countries and replace the current population with different racial groups, different cultural practices, a different language, right? And that the only way to prevent that is through immigration restrictions that keep those people out, right? So we see that same idea running through all of these different immigration periods. In the 1870s, when they were talking about Chinese immigration, they didn't use the term replacement in the way that people do today, but it was that notion, right? It was that threat that this was going to transform what America was, and that was undesirable, right? And that the only way to stop that is through immigration laws. In the turn of the early 20th century, there were books that were titled The Passing of the Great Race, right? Which was the notion that through intermarriage and through the arrival of immigrants in the United States, the great white race would be replaced, right? Would pass away. People like Teddy Roosevelt used the idea of race suicide because he argued that immigrants have babies at a rate higher than white Americans did, and that if immigrants were allowed to enter the country in large number, that would be the suicide of the white race, right? So today, white supremacists might call that white genocide, right? The elimination of a white population that has fewer babies by immigrants that have more, right? So the same sort of rhetoric, I think, infuses the right-wing approach to immigration today that we see through that same historical period. So there really is a through line connecting this notion of white racial superiority with the need to protect that through immigration restrictions.
In your book, you talk about many of the organizations, also anti-immigrant organizations. And I would like our audience to understand a little bit more who is behind, who's driving the white supremacy movements, who is espousing racist ideas in the context of immigration in the United States. So to begin with the roots of the white supremacist movement, how did all this come about to bring us a little bit more to the current period?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to remember that in the early days of the United States, the most of the leaders of the country saw it as a white country, right? And so the idea today that we call white supremacy would have just been the mainstream ideas of the superiority of whites vis-a-vis other peoples, particularly blacks in slavery in that period of time. But as that system starts to shift in the aftermath of the Civil War, that's when we start to see groups emerge to kind of protect that idea or to recreate it or reimpose it. So an early version of that, of course, is the Ku Klux Klan, which emerged in the 1870s and would terrorize Black populations in the South. It went dormant for a period of time, then reemerged again in the 1920s as an anti-Black group, but also an anti-immigrant group. The second coming of the Ku Klux Klan was focused on the dangers of immigration in the aftermath of World War I, as large numbers of refugees coming from Europe to the United States were perceived to be undesirable by these extremist white supremacists. And so they organized to pressure Congress to terrorize people who were here in order to create fear and to try to protect this imaginary idea of a white country. Those ideas, of course, ebb and flow through the years since, right? And I'm sure later on we'll talk about some of the key figures in the last 30 or 40 years that have kind of recreated these ideas and closely tied it to immigration.
Something that struck me in your book was how the white supremacy movement and also the current anti-immigrant movement was born out of environmentalism in the 1960s. Could you explain a little bit the connection?
Yeah, I think that also goes back further as well. This was something that I didn't really understand before I started to really research this. But in each era, when I see the people who were engaged in anti-immigrant and white supremacist work, they also tended to be involved in the conservation movements of the era, right? So someone like Teddy Roosevelt, right, who was influential in creating national parks in the United States, is also talking about race suicide in relation to white people. Someone like Madison Grant, who wrote the book The Passing of the Great Race, was also an early advocate of protected areas in the Western United States for endangered species. So we see the same sort of connections when we get to the post-civil rights era in the U.S. So just as the Civil War period resulted in kind of a backlash and kind of a resurgence of white supremacist ideas, in the aftermath of the civil rights movement that created a set of equal rights across the country in a series of laws in the 1960s in the United States, by the early 1970s, we see a reaction starting to emerge against that. And a key part of that emerges in the conservation movement, particularly around the issue of birth rates. Right. So people like Paul Ehrlich, who writes the book The Population Bomb, is a key figure in the creation of Earth Day in the United States. But he's also a founding member and an early advocate of these anti-immigrant groups that are trying to prevent more people from entering the United States. So the Sierra Club is a place where there are these contestations around immigration restrictions as a way to protect the American environment.
You mentioned the KKK a moment ago. There's also something called the Tanton Network. What is it?
Yeah, so there is this guy named John Tanton, who is he's in a kind of a quintessentially American type character. He was an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor, who his whole life was doing eye operations, a full-time doctor. But at the same time, in the 1960s, he was inspired by Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, and he came to believe that the only way to protect the American environment was through immigration restrictions. And he realized in the 70s that there was no one making this argument. And so he took it upon himself to do it. And he, over the next 40 years, founded dozens of anti-immigrant groups, some of which are among the most influential today. And he also developed connections to some of the richest people in the United States in order to get money from them to support his anti-immigrant crusade. And he was also tied quite frequently to white supremacist groups because he found that they were among the only people, at least in the 1970s, that were publicly saying the same things he was about the dangers of immigration. So he, over these decades, founds a number of groups like the Federation for American Immigration Reform, called FAIR, a group called Numbers USA, the Center for Immigration Studies. All of these groups serve to lobby Congress to organize the grassroots in the United States and to create legislation to stop immigration into the U.S. And he is amazingly successful at it. A number of people have said he's the most influential American that no one has ever heard of.
The Tanton Network has been designated as a hate group. I think that's important to point out. If we turn now to the organizations within this network, how do they get their funding? And could you tell us a little bit more about how they operate in practice?
Yeah, so John Tanton, he was founding these groups, but he was also constantly looking for people to fund them. So in the 1980s, he was working with Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett served on the board of directors of a number of these groups and funded them during the 1980s. But in the late 1980s, he developed a strong connection with a reclusive millionaire named Cordelia Scaife May, who was an heir of the Mellon fortune. In the 1990s, she was the richest woman in the United States. And it turned out that she shared John Tanton's conservation beliefs, but also his anti-immigrant beliefs. And so he cultivated his relationship with her, got her to donate large amounts of money to him. And when she died, she left her entire fortune, which now is over $500 million, in a foundation called the Colcom Foundation. And their mission is to do conservation work. So they're based in Pittsburgh, and they fund things like rail to trail networks in Pittsburgh and nature areas in Pittsburgh. But they are also the primary funder of all of these anti-immigrant hate groups, which are designated hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So they receive tens of millions of dollars from this foundation that allows them to then go lobby Congress to create these grassroots networks, and to create legislation to support this anti-immigrant position. And in the book, I talk about the success that they've had. In the book, I document how the Trump administration ends up being populated by people who had worked at one of these different hate groups prior to joining that administration.
Do these groups have ties to news media in the United States? And if so, what kind of media? How do these organizations interact with the media ecosystem?
Yeah, so one of John Tanton's insights was that although his views are white supremacist and what we might describe as kind of far right extreme, he always tried to present himself as a centrist, right? And so, and he was really emphasizing when he was founding these groups that they were not going to be like the KKK, right? They're not wearing white robes and out there to scare people with violence. Instead, they're wearing suits, right? There are registered lobbyists. They look professional, right? He always made sure he named his groups with these benign names, right? Like the Center for Immigration Studies. You would think that that's just an institute at a university that's doing just normal research on immigration. But in fact, what these groups were doing was taking these white supremacist ideas and sanitizing them and turning them into language that could then be sent to the media. He also had the clever idea to not just found one group, but to found dozens of groups. And so the result of that is it seems like there's just this kind of natural landscape of all of these different anti-immigrant groups, whereas in reality, they were all founded by this one guy, John Tanton, and they were all funded by this one woman, Cordelia Scaife May. But nevertheless, when like the New York, in the book, I document how like in 2005, when there were debates around an immigration law, the New York Times would write an article and they would do interviews with 3 different organizations, right? And one would be the Federation for American Immigration Reform. The next would be Numbers USA. The next would be the Center for Immigration Studies. And wow, all of them are talking about the dangers of immigration. And they don't realize that they are all created by the same guy and funded by the same lady.
You just mentioned a little bit how these organizations talk about immigration. So I wanted to ask you how they frame the immigration debate, and specifically also how they refer to immigrants.
Yeah, I think what they've been successful at doing is shifting the Overton window, right? If you're familiar with this concept, it's kind of the boundaries of what is acceptable thought in the United States. And so what they've done a really good job of doing is talking about immigration as if it's always a problem, right? It's they never frame immigration as something that creates a positive force, right? They frame it as a problem that needs to be solved. And you can see in the way that the media talks about immigration in the United States that has really changed in the past 20 years from being a thing that supposedly the U.S. is founded on as a nation of immigrants, right, towards this idea that all immigration is a problem of some kind, right? Even though all of the academic research suggests that immigrants are beneficial to receiving communities, that they have positive economic impacts over time, that's not how the media describes it. Instead, it's always about the burden that it places on the local economy, the burden it places on the government, the way that immigrants are taking housing or they're taking jobs, even though all of those things are not supported by any actual data. What these groups have done is to talk about it in these ways and to create kind of pseudo-scientific studies that seem to support that, right? And by being a group that looks like it's an academic institution, the Center for Immigration Studies, it makes it seem like these are true ways of representing this. And so it's been a very powerful effort by these Tanton Network groups to move the discourse in the United States away from the way that immigration might have been talked about in the 1970s towards the notion that it's a threat, that it's an invasion, that it's a problem, and that really the only solution is to kind of completely close the border.
Before we turn to some of the laws that have tried to restrict immigration in the United States, I would like you to put some faces to this anti-immigrant movement. You mentioned some of the influential organizations in the Tanton Network, but could you also share with the audience who some of the influential individuals in this movement are?
Yeah, well, in the founding of the Tanton Network, it's people like Paul Ehrlich. It's also Garrett Hardin, who is famous for his The Tragedy of the Commons essay, right? But he was an early supporter of John Tanton and on the board of directors of all of these sort of groups. More recently, we would see people like Stephen Miller being a key figure associated with the Tanton Network. So when Donald Trump announced his first presidency for the United States in 2015, you remember him coming down the golden escalator and saying that Mexicans were, rapists and violent and killers. Just the week before that, Stephen Miller had been giving a keynote speech at the Center for Immigration Studies. So at one of these Tanton Network groups. And a couple of years ago, some of Stephen Miller's emails were leaked. And it turned out that during the first Trump campaign, he was in email contact with a Tanton Network group, a designated hate group, at least once a week during that entire period. So he was contacting them, asking them how to frame these issues, asking them for studies to support some sort of argument they were making. And then he would take those things to Trump, who would say them right there on the campaign trail. So Stephen Miller is clearly a very key connector between the Tanton network and the administration. Jeff Sessions as well, who was a senator from Alabama and then was Trump's first attorney general, is also someone who has a long history with these Tanton network groups, who gave speeches at their conferences and raised up their ideas. So he's certainly someone else that kind of bridges between these groups. In the book, I documented over 20 people who had worked for or who had written articles for these hate groups, who then took jobs in the Trump administration. And we see the same thing happening again this time around. Like many of these same individuals have positions in the current Trump administration.
We touched on how white supremacist ideas have shaped debates on immigration, and in a moment we're going to talk about immigration laws. But the terrorist attacks of 9/11, how have they shaped immigration narratives, but also policies on immigration and borders?
Yeah, I mean, of course, September 11th was a crucial event in the United States in terms of transforming the way that the country thought about its borders. And in the aftermath, the Department of Homeland Security was created, which kind of consolidated all of the different groups that managed borders in the United States. And created a lot more funding for these groups, right? So we see the construction of border walls after that. We see the number of Border Patrol agents doubling and doubling again in the years after those attacks. So it kind of transforms the way that the United States even thought about its borders, and kind of made the border something that was at the forefront of people's minds, right? So just as the Tanton Network did a good job of talking about immigration in a way as if it's a problem, right? I think after September 11th, the border really comes to the forefront as something that's a problem, right? And something that needs to be managed. And that plays right into, of course, the Tanton Network's efforts.
The US Congress has passed many pieces of immigration legislation, of course, over the years. Could you perhaps pick some of the major laws that exist in the United States nowadays? What are they, and what did they try to do?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many these days that I think are complicated and difficult. I might go back just a little bit and emphasize the 1924 Immigration Act, which was the first one that had kind of comprehensive rules about who could enter the country, right? Before that, there weren't any such things, right? And I think all of the laws that we have since then are kind of based on that act, right? On the notion that all immigration to the US should be regulated, and it should be regulated based on the country that someone's coming from. So I think those are crucial things. One of the problems in the United States is that it's very difficult now to legally immigrate to the country, right? There are not that many legal mechanisms to enter the country. And the current Trump administration wants to restrict those, right? To pull those back in as many ways as that they can. During the first Trump administration, I think the estimates are that about 1 million legal immigrants less came during that 4 years than would have come if the regular laws had been left in place and there hadn't been efforts to restrict that. So they're against both legal means to enter the country and irregular means to enter the country.
When we talk about laws and policies, perhaps our attention becomes focused a little bit too much on the political arena. Has there been support from American society for immigration laws, and where has the support come from?
Yeah, I think the support for immigration laws tends to vary quite a bit by political party in the United States. So those on the right tend to be quite supportive of immigration restrictions, and those on the left more open to them. When we look at public opinion polls in the country, even during the first Trump administration and during Trump's election, even though there was this kind of media representation that people were really against immigration, right? And there's this kind of groundswell of anti-immigrant sentiments that was not reflected in public opinion polls, right? Most people during that period were saying that immigrants made the country stronger. But I think what we see, though, is that anti-immigrant voices in the US are very loud ones, right? They tend to have immigration as their primary or their only issue, and they talk about that constantly, right? Whereas on the left in the US, there are a lot of other issues that tend to be prominent, whether it's from diversity or women's rights or the abortion issue or healthcare, right? There's a wide range of things that are important. So I feel like what often happens in the US is that when a Republican administration comes in, they focus on immigration, they ratchet up the types of things that they're doing. And then if Democrats come in, they often keep those things, right? Because it's not the primary issue necessarily for their voters, even though their voters might not really support some of these aggressive measures. It's not the biggest priority to walk them back. And so it's resulted in an immigration system that's very difficult to access, and that doesn't provide the right number of immigration visas for people to come to the US to work, which forces people into these alternative means to enter the country.
Immigrants in the United States play an important role in certain sectors. We can think of agriculture, also construction, also hospitality. And so you mentioned in your books that actually labor unions have at times been supportive of restrictions. And in a way, this might seem counterintuitive, but this opposition on the part of the labor unions, how do you explain it?
Yeah, I think there's the perception that new immigrants have more competition with people working in working class jobs, right? So a new immigrant who comes to the US who doesn't have a lot of education, or maybe their English skills aren't as good, they're going to compete often in the lower income scales. And so many labor unions that represent those income scales have at times been against immigration. However, what we see, though, if we look at the data over long periods of time in the US, we see that it doesn't show any evidence that more immigration affects the wages of those people at the lower economic scales. And even if it did show slight impacts, I would say that the right response is to provide aid to those people, right? So some sort of supplement or support, rather than spending the billions of dollars that the country currently does on walls, on violence, and on restrictions, on deportations, on detention. That money would be much better spent supporting people, right? Through healthcare, through aid, through payments, right? If there is some sort of income impact of immigration.
If immigration laws have tried to create restrictions on certain nationalities, how effective have the laws been at doing that?
So the US has not changed its fundamental immigration law since 1965, right? So the main system has been in place for a very long period of time, where the world has transformed since then. And so the immigration law is not responsive, I don't think, to the realities of the current world that we live in. But of course, there have been these immigration debates, and for the right in the US, they don't want any immigration, right? So their view would be zero immigration is the right level of immigration. So anytime that these things get opened up for a debate, it's always shifting towards that more restrictive position. Whereas in reality, what we need to be doing is shifting in the other direction, right? Is finding more mechanisms for people to be able to come, using this money to support people who are here, who are coming, rather than finding ways to restrict it. If we look to the future, right, I mean, we're entering an era of climate disruptions. The world is going to see more people migrating in the years to come than are currently migrating. And so there are two ways to address that. One is the approach that many wealthy countries are taking right now, which is violence, which is putting up walls, which is hiring more border guards, which is using detention and restrictions, and spending billions of dollars to do that. The other option, of course, would be to accept the fact that these people are going to be moving and find ways to accommodate that, right? And find ways for safe passage, find ways to integrate these people into the communities and economic systems of the places that they're going. That's a vision of what a world could look like. But with the current politics in the United States, that's not a vision of what's going to happen.
In the final part of this episode, I'd like to turn to the link between white supremacy and the Trump administrations. As the Latino population in the United States has grown, people might think that Latinos are perhaps inclined to vote for the Democrats. But we have seen in the recent elections that this is not necessarily the case. So starting with the Republican Party, what is that party's relationship to the Latino population? How has this party perhaps shifted its thinking over the years in order to appeal also to that population?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question. And the United States, of course, is an enormous country with diverse groups of people. So even when we say Latino, that means very different things in different places, right? Someone who is in Miami and has a heritage from Cuba, they have fled communism and tend to be pretty right wing, right, because of the capitalist beliefs that brought them to the country, right? Whereas someone who has newly arrived, from Venezuela would have different sets of beliefs and ideas. So it's hard, I think, to make a big generalization like that. And although the Latino population in the U.S. did shift towards Trump in this last election, still the vast majority of Latino people in the U.S. voted for the Democrats, right? So it's not like the Republicans got the majority in that area. I think what you did see, and this is a trend I think you see in a lot of countries and over different racial groups over different periods of time, is that once one group has arrived in a country and has been there and established for some period of time, they tend to want to pull up the bridge on the next group, right? And so the people that we see in the Latino community who are voting for Trump are often the people who've been in the U.S. for a few decades, right? Or and feel like their position is threatened by these new people who are coming for a different reason or for a different purpose. And so it's often that sort of a relationship that we see in terms of voting for the right. I think there's a whole other set of things you could see here that is not about immigration at all, right? That the Latino population in the U.S. has economic issues, right? And the pandemic was pretty devastating to a lot of people. We saw inflation. We saw a loss of buying power. We saw a lot of people feeling like they're struggling to get by. And that happened under Biden's watch, under the Democrats. And so that wasn't working for a lot of people, right? And the Democrats ended up during that election defending the system, which the system wasn't liked at that moment, right? And I think that you can explain, I think, some share of this shifting votes for these economic issues and not really even understand it at all as an immigration question.
Is the Republican Party a party that actually has something to offer to immigrants in the United States, or has it simply shifted its discourse to appeal to that part of the population? And in reality, it is still a party that speaks more to working class whites and their grievances.
Yeah, I would say it's the latter. I mean, if you look at the people who are in positions of power in the Republican Party, like Donald Trump, like Stephen Miller, they have a long history of white supremacist actions and beliefs and statements. And so I would suggest that although there has been some shift at the margins towards the Republicans in some minority communities, that does not mean that party has their interests at front of mind, right? I think instead the anti-immigrant actions of the party, the movements away from diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, right? Which these are just different ways of saying white supremacy, right? I mean, it's just a different term for the same idea. So I think you can see kind of a through line with these past practices, and so I think that continues to be the dominant thread in the Republican Party.
Donald Trump, we might say, is perhaps a peculiar figure who has a certain way of speaking to people, whether he's at rallies, whether he's in the White House, and perhaps his political incorrectness is part of the appeal for many people. Could you talk a little bit more about who the people now are, the people who surround Donald Trump now that he's back in the White House, and how their views are shaping the national policy narrative and policy making?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the immigration area, I mean, Donald Trump has Stephen Miller back in the White House in a key advisor role, and he has spent his entire career trying to limit immigration. There are other figures like Tom Homan, who's someone who has worked at Tanton Network Groups, has written for them. He is now in the border czar position. So they've also shifted around a lot of immigration officers towards focusing on deportations. They've set up Guantanamo Bay as a place to hold extra people. They're looking for new contracts for the private security industry to hold immigrants in detention before they deport them. So I think what we will see is a whole series of efforts to crack down on immigrants in the United States and to make it difficult to live in the country without the proper documents, and even to threaten people who do have the proper documents, right? I mean, we've all been following the story of the Columbia student who is a green card holder, right? He has permanent residency in the United States, but is currently in immigration detention. So there's no doubt that the current administration wants to do as many possible things as they can to reduce the number of immigrants in the United States.
A slogan of the Trump administration and also Donald Trump's supporters is making America great again. Different people might read different things into these four words. How do you interpret making America great again?
I mean, the first thing to emphasize is that Make America Great Again is a phrase on the right, a slogan for decades, right? So, we see it in the 1930s by groups that were very much associated with white supremacists. So it has its origins in that. I think something that's interesting is that the idea of when this great period was, I think, has shifted in the current Trump administration. I mean, if you had asked me in the first administration, I would have said it's maybe the 1950s is the decade that was great for Trump. But I feel like this time around, it's maybe like the 1880s, right? I mean, he's going much further back with a vision of America as an expansionary country, a vision of America that doesn't respect any other cultures anywhere in the world. We see that with the pulling back of things like USAID. We see it with the idea of taking Canada, of taking Greenland, of taking the Panama Canal, of taking Gaza and turning that into some sort of hotel district. So it's really a vision of this like 1880s period. And that's a period when there was certainly a very strong resurgence of these white supremacist ideas. Finally, it's also an era of rampant capitalism in the United States, right? This is an era before any sort of worker protections. It's an era of the robber barons. And I feel like Trump wants us to take us back to that.
The first Trump administration pursued certain measures to deter unauthorized migrants, but also asylum seekers. And it seems the second Trump administration is interested in reprising at least some of these measures or even expanding them. what were some of the key policy initiatives of the first administration that we might see again in the second administration?
So the first thing I would emphasize is what I mentioned before, is that the Biden administration did not remove many of these things, right? So a lot of these things stayed in place during the Biden period. But I think that they'll continue to try to push these things further, right? I mean, I think there'll be efforts to not have any asylum in the United States because there's the belief that the asylum system is broken. The idea that you can cross a border and apply for political asylum based on the conditions in your home country. That I think on the right, there's the belief that that's being abused and that system should just be gotten rid of. And the U.S. is certainly moving in that direction. There's also just efforts, and I document this in the book, in White Borders, that in the last Trump administration, there were over 1,000 different changes that they made to different policies to make it just more difficult for people to immigrate, right? And it was things as small as, on documents, if you left a space blank on a document, like if it asked for your 5 brothers and sisters, but you only had 1 brother and sister, and you just left the rest of those blank instead of writing NA, that they would reject it as an incomplete application, right? So there are all kinds of things like that they've implemented just to make it so much more difficult for people to immigrate to the country. I think we'll just see more and more of that in the coming years. I think they'll spend more money on the border wall. They'll hire more border patrol agents, and they've already removed distinctions about focusing on deporting criminals instead of just people with immigration violations. They're deporting anyone now. They're also doing arrests at places like schools and churches and hospitals that before had been off limits for doing these things. So I think you're just going to see a much more aggressive effort to make the United States inhospitable to immigrants.
In the first episode, we mentioned this conflict between two visions, universalism and white supremacy. And so to conclude this second episode, I wanted to ask you, if we assume that this struggle between the two visions is going to continue during the Trump administration, what prospects do you see for this universalist position to at least not to lose out to white supremacy? How might it be defended during the Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly under threat. I mean, we see that the Trump administration and the executive office is focused on limiting these things, right? They're cracking down on immigration. They're removing the diversity, equity, and inclusion things, right? That's another way of saying that they're going to support the white population of the country. So there certainly is an attack on these kind of universalist notions in the country. And so far, it looks like the Congress of the United States is not standing up to that. Supposedly, in the American system, the Congress is supposed to be the check on what the executive is doing because the Congress controls the money. But currently, that's not providing to be any sort of a check at all. So at the moment, it's the courts that are still holding the line, that are abiding by the documents and the rule of law in the country. But that's under threat too, right? I mean, you see people like the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, saying that any judges that go against some of these actions by the Trump administration should be impeached, should be removed from office, or maybe even ignored. And that's certainly concerning. So in terms of steps that could be taken, I think that people need to speak up for what they believe, that they need to talk about the benefits of immigration and to not let the right-wing perspective that all immigration is bad to dominate the way that we see these things, right? To make the positive case for immigration and to defend those universalist ideas and to argue that we don't want to go back to the 1880s. We don't want to have a white supremacist government in the United States. But yeah, it's dark times.
There was Reece Jones, author of White Borders. Reece, thank you very much for joining me on Common Ground.
Thanks for having me.